Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion in honor of Black History Month. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Richard LaRochelle. I am a project manager at the Center for Equity of Care. Just a few housekeeping rules to keep in mind before we get started. Please be sure that you are muted for this discussion. Also, we will have a section of the discussion devoted to Q&A. So please do leave questions in the chat, and we will do our best to make sure that they are addressed. At this time, I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Kraut, our EVP of Strategy and Analytics, who will provide our welcome remarks and introduce our speakers. Jeff?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, actually, to everybody. And this is a real important conversation we're going to have, and I think we couldn't have invited a better individual in Elaine Gross to join with us, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first, I want to introduce our interviewer, who's also hosting today, is Jon Sendach. You know, a lot of you know him already, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. All right, and Jon was appointed our executive director at North Shore University Hospital in January in 2020. And 2 months later, we had a worldwide pandemic. Coincidence? I think not. But Jon was the right person at the right time, at the right place. And he navigated through extraordinary challenges with an amazing clinical and administrative team, and did us proud. Now, Jon's held a number of positions with us over his tenure at the health system, which is a number of years. He was a deputy executive director at Glen Cove. He is a graduate of our administrative fellows. He actually was one of the first in the formative years of the program. And outside of work, Jon is a 25-year member of the Roslyn Rescue Fire Company. He's a volunteer. He's a firefighter. He twice served as captain. He's an EMT. And, you know, Jon's that kind of guy that whatever he does it with gusto and leadership and commitment. And because he was recognized with their Distinguished Service Award, it says a lot about Jon, about his leadership style. Oh, and if you have to get somewhere quickly, Jon's your guy. He's also a licensed pilot. So he teaches health policy at NYU Wagner School. And he was named of Long Island Business's 40 under 40 and is serving today as our host and as our interviewer. But it's my real pleasure to introduce our guest is Elaine Gross. Elaine is the founder and president of Erase Racism. Now, I don't know if you know about this organization, but you're certainly going to understand it and appreciate the work that Elaine and the organization has done. It was founded in 2001. I happen to have served on its board of College of Advisors. And this is one of the most important Long Island-based regional civil rights organization that has an amazingly successful track record in exposing and addressing the devastating impact of historical and ongoing structural racism, particularly in housing and public school education in our community. Under Elaine's leadership, Erase Racism probably has gotten national recognition as a champion of fair housing. It publishes research reports. It undertakes litigation when necessary. It advocates for policy change, and it heightens, most importantly, the public awareness of the context of structural racism as it relates to different forms of discrimination and segregation. So Elaine's actions have, as I've known her, she defines the essence of a successful community advocacy. Her efforts have resulted in amending and strengthening our fair housing laws, litigation against property owners and management companies that have discriminated in showing rental apartments based on rates. She led the campaign that in 2016, she started in 2019, New York's enactment of a ban on housing discrimination against people who depend on illegal non-wage sources of income for rent. She might touch on that. That campaign also was it was co-led by Erase Racism, but she created an advocacy group that grew to almost 100 other organizations. And if those of you who read Newsday, you'll remember their series on Long Island Divided series. That was based on the foundational work conducted by Elaine in Erase Racism. And one of my favorite achievements that Elaine oversaw was the creation of this award-winning documentary, A Tale of Two Schools, and Race and Education on Long Island. You know, when you look at Long Island, there is a lot of things. On average, we have great health outcomes, income, school support, just great on average. The problem is the distance between the highs and the lows. And it's that distance that Elaine has been working to close that gap. So Elaine asked the question, how do you build a just Long Island? And it's how we transform integrate our communities, that there's no person has access to opportunity that's limited by race or ethnicity. Now, I know today's conversation is going to enlighten you. It's going to make you think, and it's going to help you see the world a bit differently. But I do hope that today's conversation is going to also make you a bit uncomfortable, because all too often we have polite conversation about race and social equity, and I don't think that's the most effective way to engender action. I think making people uncomfortable and having very direct talk about what its impact is and what we can do means that we're going to be part of the solution. If we're going to change our way of business, our way of living, how we advocate on Long Island, then you have to experience that emotion as well to make meaningful change in our society. So I'm going to turn it back to Jon. I know we're going to have a great conversation, and I hope everybody pays attention. Jon?
Jeff, thank you so much. And I greatly appreciate your introduction, and welcome everybody this afternoon, and welcome to Elaine. I'm really looking forward to this. I've been thinking about this for the last couple of weeks as we kind of put our thoughts together. And I think all of you will find this extremely enlightening. And as Jeff said, at times a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that's an important part of this. I will share with you that as one of the executives in the health system responsible for a very large hospital and medical center, a place I've worked for some time in a community that I've grown up, I'm learning too. And this has been a year of learning, not just about the pandemic, but in many ways about what affects our employees. And one of the greatest opportunities I have had, and it came through some urging of some of our employees at North Shore, and these things are playing out around Northwell Health, and many of you are participating, is encouraging people to have a conversation about things that in the past, perhaps we were all a little uncomfortable with. And here at North Shore, I've had the good fortune of leading a group that I named an advisory council to the CEO of the hospital about issues of social justice or injustice. And it has allowed me, through a group of employees who voluntarily come and meet with me, to help me understand things about what it's like to work here, but also what it's like to live around here that were unknown to me, or I didn't fully appreciate the depth of. And I think all of us, no matter what role you play in the organization, have an obligation to always be learning and listening, and trying to figure out ways to address, to the degree you can, things that may be not your doing, but because of the role that any of us play with health equity and outcomes, and with management and how we affect the community of people that work with us, to take steps to improve situations. So I am delighted to have the chance today to be joined by Elaine, and we are going to engage in a fireside style chat. I have some questions for Elaine, which I'll be asking her, and I'm looking forward to hearing from her. And then we will allow time for all of you to ask some questions. So the chat will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And later toward the end, we promise to allow time for us to go through those questions, and we will pose some of those questions either to Elaine to respond to. And so begin thinking about that as we kind of go through this. If something strikes you, just put a question into the chat, and Rich and Jordan at the end will help us get through those. Before I ask my first question, though, I want to turn the floor over to Elaine and welcome her virtually to Northwell. We're excited to hear from you today, and give you a chance to make some opening remarks.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me. And Jeff really did a great job of saying a bit about what we do over at Erase Racism. I would say that one aspect of our work is educating the public. And so we do a lot of work around consultation with organizations, institutions, as well as various kinds of workshops and educational events. And I'd like to say something that I say at all of those events, which is our objective at Erase Racism is never blaming or shaming. It's never the finger of, this is how bad you are. It's always, how can we get smarter about race and racism? And how can we be moved to action? And so I hope that at the end of our fireside chat, I wish I had a fire here, that people will be moved to action, because that is ultimately what we are interested in. I don't do this work alone. We have a tiny staff, but we have a very dedicated staff and a dedicated board of directors. And we are going to be 20 years old this June. So it is an exciting time for us. This is the work that we do 12 months a year. And we're happy that at least 1 month a year, a lot of other people begin to think about some of these issues that are so critical to the country. But it's not seen in that way, but it's foundational, it's fundamental. If we don't get it right, if we don't understand the development of race and we, as a social construction, if we don't understand structural racism as being the foundation of who we are as a country, we won't actually have our glasses on that allow us to see and correct structural racism. So thank you for having me.
Welcome, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. So maybe the first question is that, as you know, in 2020, pardon me, Northwell Health declared racism a public health crisis, and Michael Dowling has been very public about that. And as we think about in the context of Black History Month this month, how do you see the connection between the call or demand for a reckoning about race in America, and specifically addressing anti-Black racism, and the increased attention from Northwell and other health institutions to issues of social justice and equity? How do you see that sort of play together?
Mm-hmm.
Elaine, you're muted. And I'm not sure how that happened. Hold on. Wait a second.
I think
Now you're back.
I'm unmuted now. Okay.
Yes.
So I would like to start with a quote from Martin Luther King. It's from March 1966. And this is what he said: of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane.
Yeah.
And he made that comment at a presentation that he gave at the Second National Convention of the Medical Committee of Human Rights. And another quote I'm going to give, which has to do with that same event. This is from a newspaper article that was covering that, so it came out the day after. And in the article, they say, this is an AP article, King and officers of the Medical Committee for Human Rights accused the American Medical Association of a, quote, conspiracy of inaction in civil rights. I mentioned that because both of those quotes, I think, are something for us to keep in mind during our discussion today. We have over 400 years of anti-Black racism embedded in the federal government, laws, policies, Supreme Court cases, affecting every single aspect of life, including related to health care, health outcomes, etc. And so with that as a backdrop, you all know already about the inequities related to access to health care, diagnosis and treatment, medical education, there are issues there, and the health outcomes, as we've mentioned, and seen so clearly related to COVID-19. And then there are all of these social determinants of health. And so when we take that into account, and we know that at least back in 1966 at this convention, some people knew and some people said. They talked about this conspiracy of inaction. It's not only what has been done, it's what has not been done. And so in many ways, that's what we're talking about today. What has not been done in face of this, as Martin Luther King referred to it, this most shocking and inhumane.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I know that a lot of people say things like, "Oh, I didn't know, I didn't realize, I hadn't thought about it." All of that is definitely an inadequate response because we have known. And we have an obligation that if you've gotten an inkling of this, you have an obligation to look very strategically and critically so that you are aware. So I feel that for Black History Month in particular, this focus to say, what is the impact? We're looking at those things that have a negative impact on Black people. What's perpetuating it? And also, what's perpetuating the white supremacy? Because often we only look at one piece of that racism, which is the impact and the discrimination and the segregation. But we don't look at the piece that actually benefits and elevates white people. So that's why we're having this conversation today, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. And the historical perspective, I think, is incredibly important. And given that history, what would you say we are called to do in 2021? Those of us who work in healthcare, as educators, as medical professionals, essential workers, what is our calling then for this year?
So, and I'm going to give the calling looking at different players to some degree. So I think institutions like Northwell really do need to take that systematic look, which I understand you've already begun that process, but that's really critical. But also in terms of the people who work for Northwell, we need to think about their rights. So people are familiar with, Patients' Bill of Rights and things of that nature. But there are all of these people who care for the rest of us, and who are having to do this work within the context of everyone who's living in this soup of structural racism, which means that staff, patients, vendors, you name it, everybody, all of those people come to work or come to the hospital as a patient or to the outpatient care, et cetera. And they are bringing with them everything from our broader society, all of their experiences, and all of that has been shaped by structural racism. That means that everybody who is working is subject to, on so many different levels, the kinds of intentional and unintentional behaviors and actions that continue the racial trauma that people of color, people who look like me, have to deal with every day. And so in a sense, and I call on the institutions a lot because that's where the power is. The institutions have a responsibility to really think about the multiple impacts that staff would have to undergo, as well as their patients, obviously, to make sure on both sides of the care spectrum, if you will. There also need to be look very closely at curriculum, and curriculum is not just in medical schools, and it needs to be looked at closely there, but anywhere people are being trained and educated or being oriented for their positions at the hospital. All of those are places where if there isn't some conversation about these issues, that means people are coming into their place with being unchallenged and carrying forth all of those things which we know are harmful. Yeah. And I would just say, finally, one final note here is too often we don't say anything, and silence speaks louder than 1,000 words. The silence really says, this isn't important, this isn't central, this is something that is kind of an add-on, an extra, or doesn't matter at all. I mean, to go to the other extreme.
Yeah, and Elaine, I'll say to you before I go to the next question that as part of my own learning as a hospital executive over the last year, one of the notes I took and I shared with our executive team at this institution, I shared this with some of my colleagues at other medical centers in the health system, is that issue around silence. That until I understood from speaking to staff about this very issue, it had not occurred to me the power of silence in sending a certain message about what is and is not acceptable. And a lot of it, and it was important to hear from some of the staff who shared it with me, that the perception isn't even that that's necessarily coming from a bad place, meaning that it's done deliberately. It could be coming from a place of discomfort, an inability to be comfortable talking about something because of a fear of saying the wrong thing. But everybody noted that, at least to me, the small group of staff had shared with me, and they had culled information from their colleagues, that when a manager or someone of power and authority says anything, even if it doesn't come out right or whatever, it shows that there's an understanding that something is not acceptable, or that that doing so as leaders is better than being silent, to your point. And that is something I certainly took note of, and I'm grateful to the people who pointed that out to me, because as you noted in medical school, I went to graduate school for healthcare management. They certainly never told me that in any class. So I think that that's important, that we're all thinking about how we continue to learn by listening to other people. And let's talk for a minute about, I think, and this is a bigger conversation and probably a longer response, but and I think the education to us all will be valuable in hearing your perspective on this. But talk to us a little bit about implicit bias and microaggressions. You noted some of the things that people of color experience. What is meant by those two terms, microaggressions and implicit bias? And why do you think it's important to sort of talk about this, even if it's uncomfortable?
Sure. So implicit bias really is a term that refers to the brain's automatic responses to stereotypes and to, it's an instant association, if you will, with, and I would make a point of saying, with that structural racism soup that we're living in. So it's not, sometimes people say, oh, well, it's just implicit bias. It doesn't really have anything to do with. And then they say, nothing to do with racism, nothing to do with, a variety of things. In fact, implicit bias has everything to do with whatever we have experienced, because the science around how your automatic brain works is it's faster. We like to think of ourselves as we're very thoughtful and we make decisions after we've considered and all of this. The reality is that we humans, our automatic brain is working faster at at speeds that are, and sometimes those speeds, by the way, save our lives, right?
Right, they stop you from stepping out in front of a car that's coming down the street, right?
That's right. They move our hand away from getting burned on a hot surface or something.
Right.
But in the context of our discussion today, that automatic brain function is going to go to the place of everything having to do with structural racism. So it's going to go to the stereotypes, it's going to go to the attitudes toward particular groups, all without our conscious awareness, but that's where it's going to go. And we know something about how it develops, this implicit bias. So we start out as little bitty babies. We don't know anything. We are influenced by our immediate surroundings. So you're talking about family members and, caregivers or whatever. Then we have the institutional and cultural piece when we get a little older, that's influencing what we think. And that gives us and that could be from religious standpoints, schools, television, legal systems, medicine, business, etc. Could be cultural stuff, practices, song lyrics, language, media, again, patterns of thought. All of those things are that socialization process. It's going into who we are, how we think, etc. And so the problem is we don't really interrogate that. For the most part, it's kind of, we are the way we are, and that's it. And so it's not until we consciously try to learn about our biases, consciously try to de-bias, that we make any headway. So in other words, all of that remains, whether you are a 5-year-old just learning, or whether you're now an advanced degree person, unless you really had an opportunity to think about the issue of those biases that have been formed, it is surprising to what extent we carry with us all of those things, even if we think we're beyond that. So how does that come out? There will be people who will say to me, here I am running this organization for 20 years, and I had other professional life, and I have a graduate degree. And they will say things like, oh, you're so articulate, Elaine. And they think it's a compliment.
Interesting.
And, so the question is, well, what would I be? What do you think I would be? You've seen me, you've seen published op-eds that I've written. I'm an intelligent person, just like a whole lot of other people are. So right. Why would you say that? Why is it that, and I'm sure if you ask, people will tell you this within your institutions, that you will find that people who are, let's say you have a room, and you have someone of color who is a senior person, and then you have some other people in the room, and somebody comes in and they have questions, or they're, it could be a patient that has questions, or it could be a business meeting or whatever. And people will not turn to the person of color who's actually the senior person. They'll turn to somebody else to talk to them, to ask them questions, to find out what they have to say about something. The implicit bias is operating when patients may not want to take the word or to take care from someone of color, because in their mind, either that person doesn't belong in that position or they are suspicious of that person. And we get the messages from everywhere. This implicit bias doesn't come from nowhere. And it doesn't only come from what we learned as a young person. Right now, people have very clearly in their mind that Black men are dangerous, that Black men are criminals, they're thugs. And they got that message day in and day out from the media, from the, from their friends, from the police. Police have basically said, well, it's okay if we do this, if we kill Black men. So the messages that we get, and sometimes in our workshops, we have like 1 million slides that we show people. And, they're always shocked by it. You show them the same scene, one with a Black person, one with a white person. They're after one of the hurricanes. I don't know if it's Hurricane Katrina or another one, but the Black person, the caption was looting and whatever after the storm. The white person was finding some food and supplies after the storm. The pictures are identical.
Right. Interesting.
But, yeah, they're wading through water, but the caption is different. So that implicit bias, it
keeps building on itself.
It's a cumulative and compounding effect. Right. You can't get away from it. And so the only way to get at it is to learn about our biases, to try to there's a whole process related to debiasing, where you learn to be a slow thinker, because your automatic brain is more likely to kick in when you're especially when you're busy,
right.
When you're overwhelmed and when you're tired, and there are a lot of things like that. But broadening your perspective is very important. So that's why I started with structural racism and 400 years of history, because until you become more conscious of this structural racism, you won't understand where some of that stuff is coming from. You mentioned microaggressions, and similarly, we like to label, the universal we, like to label things. Okay. I think sometimes we like to label things because it helps us to then put it aside. I think microaggressions is one of those things, because generally people say that microaggressions are the sort of the small slights or insults or indignities and denigrating messages to someone because of their membership in a marginalized group. And in fact, the microaggressions can produce the same, it's implicit bias. Those actions can produce the same kinds of outcomes.
Despite the fact that they might be small
that's right. Despite the fact people might think that they're small. The comments about where are you from? And then it becomes, well, where are you really from? And sometimes people do that, especially if somebody has an accent, let's say, that's not the, whatever is considered I think we all have accents, but there are accents that are considered the normal ones.
Right.
So if someone speaks differently from that, it doesn't just become where are you from, where they can say, oh yeah, well, I was born here on Long Island, blah, 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 blah. It becomes, well, where are you really from? There is those kinds of things. All of this can produce very similar outcomes as racism produces. And this is why I think people sometimes are more comfortable talking about implicit bias and microaggressions because they feel like it gives them some distance from the issue of racism. And I would say structural racism, because I'm very concerned about the way our government and other private and public institutions have created and perpetuated the racial disadvantages for people of color and the advantages for white people. And so with the microaggressions, there are ways to, if one really wanted to get underneath that and sort of not perpetuate it, so to speak. Some of the unproductive phrases are, when somebody tells you something that's happened to them, for you to say, oh, well, I don't think they really meant it that way. You're already, to that person, you've just said.
Dismissive?
That's right. You've already dismissed the concern that the person has raised with you. There is sometimes people say things like, it's not normal. The word normal is we should just get rid of that, that term, because it constantly gets us into trouble and it's problematic. People will say things, oh, well, maybe you're just being too sensitive. And these are all things that we take in. None of us is made of steel, even though if you get to where I am at this point in my life, you've seen a lot and heard a lot. And so maybe there's more that I can let run off my back than some other people. But the fact is, this can drive you crazy. Quite literally.
And Elaine, I don't mean to cut you off, because I want you to finish what you want as microaggressions, but just to go back to that one thought that you just shared before, which I thought was very impactful, about not saying, I'm in an attempt to pacify somebody's concern about a statement that gets made and saying, I'm sure that's not what they meant, appears dismissive. What is your advice to people? What is a more appropriate way to respond to something like that?
So,
what is a way to not end up walking into that situation?
So the first thing you want to do is acknowledge what's being said.
Yeah.
And you can say honestly, I didn't even hear that. Sometimes people witness things.
Right.
And so someone might say to you, did you hear what she just said?
Right.
Or whatever. And so the thing to say is to just automatically go to a place of, okay, there's something that I don't know about.
Yep.
And so what do you do when there's something you don't know about?
Learn.
You learn.
That's right.
And you also assume that because someone said something to you, another appropriate thing to say is, oh, I'm sorry that I'm sorry that's what was said to you. Obviously, that was something that was upsetting to you.
Yes, right.
And you want to go to a place of empathy, not a place of being
Dismissive.
Dismissive. And so that will help you get going.
Yeah.
There's no easy way to kind of say exactly what you say. It all depends on what your relationship is with the other person.
How much you're trusted.
Correct. And you always want to ask permission also. Sometimes you might see something and you don't necessarily just sort of, then now you take over. John decides, oh, I just saw this. So now John decides exactly what the other person is feeling and what this should happen, and it begins to orchestrate.
Yeah.
No, you need to speak to the person to say, boy, I just saw what happened there. And depending on what frame of mind they're in, they may be relieved that somebody saw this
and spoke to them about it.
Spoke to them, and it may be, oh, has this happened to you before, or is this the way so and so always is, or you know what I mean? It then becomes a respectful dialogue.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the who is the guy that scoops into to be the Superman, the kind of a Superman or Robin Hood comes in and
Saves the day.
save the day. Yeah.
Right.
And so that kind of rescue stuff can also be disempowering.
Yeah.
So
Even if it's with good intention.
even if it's with good intention.
Right.
So,
It ends up being defeating in some ways. Yeah.
yeah. So I want people, I'm glad you mentioned the word intention, because everything that we're talking about is the intention part comes in what you do to correct the problem. You have to be intentional. You have to be systematic. Otherwise, it won't get corrected. But throw out the window this whole notion that what I intend can't create, a negative impact. That it's all about what I intend. What we have to look at are the impacts.
Yeah.
And so there is, in structural racism, there's a lot that's done through policy, which people may or may not be intentional about that.
But the outcome is what the outcome is.
The outcome is.
Right. And so using, I don't mean to cut you off, but using intention as a yardstick is not even valid. Ultimately, it's based on outcome.
It's based on outcome.
Yeah.
And so you do need to be intentional in terms of when you're trying to correct an issue.
Right.
And then you need to take that little scientific method. Here's what we intended to do. Now let's see if we really did that.
Yeah.
That really the outcome, did we get the outcome that we intended? And if not, you need to go back to the drawing board. And sometimes we really fall into the notion that, I couldn't have said something that was offensive because I never intended to do that. And yes, you could have.
Totally.
That policy isn't, can't possibly be a problem because we never intended for it to be discriminatory. But it can be.
It turns out, right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Before we kind of open it up to the group for questions, because I feel like I did interrupt you and I apologize, but I just wanted to kind of get to the nuance of my understanding of it as well. Anything more about the microaggressions that you didn't have a chance to share? And then I'll open it up.
Really, this isn't a workshop on microaggressions. So it really is just trying to give a little bit of a framework, to think about some issues that maybe haven't been top of mind.
Absolutely.
And, and it's, there's a video that talks about microaggressions that's really great. It has a couple of curse words in it. So I think some people.
So it's not PG-13.
But it talks about microaggressions being like a bee sting. And if you get one bee sting, it's annoying.
Right.
But the thing is, microaggressions are like constant bee stings, day after day, all day long, etc. And then it's no longer, this is why I made the comment about the micro part.
Right.
It's not a little thing. At that sense,
yeah.
Cumulatively speaking.
Cumulative.
That's right. It has a tremendous impact. And sometimes that will, your staff can be demoralized by the so-called microaggressions.
Certainly.
It's really important. That's why it's important to deal with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that, as I said, that became very clear to me over the last year. The more you listen and the more you talk with people, the better. Well, thank you, Elaine, very much. I want to, we could probably spend hours talking through a lot of this. There's just so much to unpack, but I have not been watching the chat as I've been moderating this, but I know that Richard and Jordana have been, and I'm going to go ahead and have them pose the first couple of questions that might be in the chat. I know there's some comments usually in the chat, but there's some questions. And so Jordana, Richard, I'll turn it over to you for about 10 minutes of Q&A before we get to the wrap up.
Sure. Thank you, Jon and Elaine. So we have a lot of great comments and questions, and we'll just start to go through them and get through as many as we can.
Okay,
so the first one here, Elaine, we have is, from Tricia Sinclair. What's the driving force behind white supremacy in the workplace and educational system?
So the driving force is really, if you think about white supremacy, go back 400 years, more than 400 years, it really comes from the construction of whiteness. And that because we know that race is not, that it's not our genes, that, and earlier on, they talked about skull size and they had all kinds of pseudoscientific analysis of how you could group people into these so-called races, and that they had, some of them were smarter than other. And if you were a French person, the French were smarter, followed by the British and whatever. And if you were British, the British were smarter, and, et cetera. And of course, in the United States, in this country, United States, North America, we were really looked up to because of our expertise around the construction of race. And so it has allowed for the hierarchy, racial hierarchy, which has whiteness on top and blackness is on the bottom. And, other people of color fit in there in various ways and at various times. I mean, we know that there were some Europeans that came and they weren't white right away. They became white over time, usually to suit the existing people that were here. Mexicans were considered white at one point, and then they weren't white anymore. And then when they wanted their labor, they were considered white again. So, but that's really the driving force. It provides the framework that allows white people to be on top, and the beneficiaries of, we talk about in our housing work, we talk about that tremendous benefit when the federal government, starting in 1930s, decided that housing would be racially segregated and that they would do everything they could to ensure that, including requiring racial covenants in deeds that said specifically, if you're not white or Caucasian, you cannot live here. The only way you can live there is if you are a servant living in that home. And that was the case for Levittown, but many other places as well throughout the country. And so there's no better example of structural racism than the way in which repeatedly there have been little efforts. Okay, well, now we're not going to allow housing discrimination, but then we do. And then there's something else. And then there's a law, but it's not really enforced. And then we have the Fair Housing Act, which is really more specific to say, okay, you can't discriminate based on these protected classes. But then we have Newsday's investigation that came out a couple of years ago, which basically showed almost half, 49% of the Black individuals who were testers seeking to buy homes were being discriminated against. So if we can be at that point today, that is white supremacy.
Thank you, Elaine.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Elaine. So our second question comes from Tricia Sinclair. How can organizations truly support a diverse workforce when senior management does not reflect people of color in these roles?
Mm-hmm. So some of the basic issues related to putting diversity, equity, and inclusion first. You've got to aggressively seek to have people of color throughout the institution. And so that definitely means in senior management positions, on boards, all of that stuff. And sometimes people say, well, the representation, how important is that? In fact, it's not just representation in a like the crayon box, they used to have. Oh, look, well, let's see if we can get a variety of colors. No, what we're talking about is also diversity of experience, diversity of perspective. It is along with the fairness piece that says, we do a lot of work in schools, and at Hofstra University, they did some research around the tiny percentage of teachers of color, educators of color here on Long Island, Black, Hispanic, and Asian, actually, very low representation. And then I hear, well, most of the positions, they do get filled a little bit by word of mouth. Or sometimes we have substitute teachers, and so we've gotten accustomed to them, and it's easier. And we don't get enough candidates, and it's like all of these things which are said as problems. I don't see them as problems. I see them as, you just have a blueprint right there that tells you how to make changes. And so if the strategies that you've been using to figure out who you're going to hire is only producing white people, then you know that those strategies have a problem. And it doesn't matter that, well, our strategies worked from the standpoint, we have this person who was the national expert and blah, whatever it is. Yes, your strategy worked to achieve that particular goal. Now you want to make sure that your strategies work to achieve also excellence, but also from a variety of persons with different kinds of background. And we have to recognize that there are all of those reasons why we end up with people that look like ourselves. We talked about that we live in the structural racism soup. And so we have to start from the perspective of, okay, I know that regardless of what a great person I think I am, I know that my automatic brain is going to be working. And so I have to consciously find ways not to produce the same result.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. So many questions here, which is great. We're gonna move on to the next one. This one says, please advise of proper response when your manager makes an inappropriate comment. Some people are completely unaware of how they sound, how they come off, the actual impact of their words.
Mm-hmm. So that depends on your relationship with your manager. And just to be completely honest, how important it is for you to keep your job. Because some people are not at all interested in hearing the truth. And then you have to make sure that you can use some other methods of dealing with this in terms of internal structures, at your institution, to see how that can work. Because, I know it's one thing to say, oh, well, you should sit them down and just say, look, I don't know if you realize, but this is what you said to me, and this is the impact it had, and all of that. And sometimes the only thing that will do is to alert that person to the fact that you are not a team player, you're a troublemaker, and so now they're going to do everything they can to cut you off at the knees. And that's just the reality. So this is it's a little bit of a dance where you have to figure out who is this person, and also who are their allies, and who are other people within your sphere who might be an ally around this, because it helps if some other people are witnessing this. If you can position things in a way that you have some allies with you. And, so I would never tell anyone just to kind of, well, if they say so, we'll just go up to her and tell her, no, that, that will very likely result in an outcome that you did not want. And you also need to make sure whoever, to whomever you are speaking about this, that you can do it with with a level of calmness. In the moment is definitely not the place, even if you think the person might be open to hearing it. Because part of that structural racism soup automatically labels someone who looks like me, who complains about something, as the angry Black woman. And it's amazing. I'm the least angry person in terms of my outward anger. Now, what I say to my husband in private is another thing. But I mean, he knows what I really feel. But in terms of, I wouldn't be where I am, quite frankly, if I wasn't able to come back with a measured response and to get what I want, but not in the heat of the moment. But when somebody said that once, and a board member wrote a very, the board in general wrote back to say, we know Elaine Gross, and it's like, what are you talking about? That is not her. But people, don't be surprised. People will say that about you, and it's unfortunate that there's all of this navigation that has to be done, because there's this difference between intentional and what the real outcome is.
Yeah.
And so people see themselves generally as being good people. That's, there are some people who pride themselves on being, outsiders and outliers or whatever. But most people feel like they are a good person. No matter what they say, they may say outrageous things and do outrageous things. And so you just challenge their very, who they are. And it's personal, So that's what makes it so difficult.
Yeah.
So we have time for one last question, and this comes from Tanya Shaw. Her question is, do you recommend any articles or books that discuss microaggressions and eliminating this practice in organizations?
Yeah, I was hoping, Richard, you're going to pick that question because I'm interested here.
For microaggressions, I don't have, I'm sure there must be a book. I don't have any that in particular. We have a lot of resources from different places that we've utilized in our work. We that try to do it from a very accessible place.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the New York Times, for example, there was a series of videos that I find that some people find very helpful in that talk about, in that case it was implicit bias in particular. But I can certainly, I don't know if you have a way of dealing with this, I can send some links or something.
Yeah, that would be good. Without a doubt we can, and we have good channels for that type of distribution. So maybe following this link, you could share that with Jordana, and then we can make sure that for participants of this call, we get that out, and potentially even more widely than that. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll let Jordana close this out, but seriously, I need to just share with you how impactful it's been for me, and I know many of our other executive leaders who are participating in today's call, and I know for many of the staff, to have the opportunity to listen and just continue the dialogue and the education that I think we all know is incredibly important. So thank you for spending an hour with us today. And Jordan, I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, and I just
Very
want to say
welcome.
there's so many more chat questions that we'll make sure to capture and get back to this group on. But just, I know we're at time. I just want to say on behalf of the Center for Equity of Care and the Corporate Social Responsibility team, I really want to thank everyone for participating in this session. Elaine and Jon, thank you for the discussion and the insight, particularly around social justice and equity and our call to action as healthcare workers, and for the detailed explanation on implicit bias and microaggressions. Jeff, thank you for your introduction and for connecting us with Elaine. Elaine, I think we can do great work together in the future, and I look forward to partnering with you. I know we all do.
We all do.
And last but not least, a very special thank you to Richard. Thanks for partnering with me on putting this together. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the attendees
Welcome.
for your comments. Everybody have a wonderful day. Take care.
Take care,
Happy to be
everyone.
here. Bye-bye.